Hi guys, today I'm going to be reviewing A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. I believe this was published in 1996 and it's the first book in the Song of Ice and Fire series. And I think there are 5 books that have already been published, and I think there's going to be 7 in total. And there's a lot going on in this book, so to give you an idea of the setting, I'll read you part of the synopsis. In a land where summers can last decades and winters a lifetime, trouble is brewing. The cold is returning, and in the frozen wastes to the north of Winterfell, sinister and supernatural forces are massing beyond the kingdom's protective wall. The fantasy elements aren't as pronounced as I thought they were going to be. There's some creatures like the dire wolves and the White Walkers, and some allusions to other creatures, which might surface more in the other books, but this book deals mainly with family and political drama. The stories revolve mainly around the nobility, so the kings, queens, knights, lords, and their children. It doesn't really focus on the peasants or the common folk, which I think might have made this more well-rounded than it was, but it was still very interesting. There are themes of honor, trust, courage, betrayal, treachery, murder, war, death. It deals with the relationships and conflicts between a variety of families, and they each have their own symbol. For example, there's the House of the Lannisters, whose symbol is the lion, and the Starks, whose symbol is the direwolf, and then the Targaryens, whose symbol is the dragon. And there's a lot of resentment between some of these families, which ends up being enough to spark a war between them. Meanwhile, new enemies are rising from across the Narrow Sea and beyond the wall in the north as winter is approaching, and winter is coming, as the Starks like to say, which is kind of like a prophecy for the Stark house. It's a world with a unique climate in which summer and winter can last for years at a time, and the winters are brutally cold and dark. It's a very scary and dangerous time, and with winter approaching, their priorities should really be on preparations and protecting each other, but instead they start this war with each other, and basically that's only going to exacerbate things, which is something that the next books are going to deal with, I imagine. This one really revolves around their Game of Thrones, basically, fighting for the right to rule the realm, and there's going to be a lot of consequences and sacrifices because of that, which reminds me of a quote from this book. That sort of captures the essence of what's going on in this book. We get to see how the war and everything that's happening affects each of the characters, and this book is set up where each chapter is a different character. So when you reach a new chapter, it switches to a different character and where they are in the story and their perspective. There are a whole plethora of characters, but I think it switches between 8 different characters, and there's adults as well as children. I was definitely more excited to read about certain characters more than others, but overall I really appreciated each of the perspectives. In the beginning I loved Bran. He's a little boy and he was very adventurous. He liked to climb and be around pros, but you didn't hear as much from him later in the story. There's Sansa, who's a young teenage girl. She's very naive and girly and definitely a hopeless romantic, which is part of what is annoying about her character, but at the same time her character is very realistic and it leaves a lot of room for growth. And there's Arya, which in a world with traditional gender roles, of course you have to have your tomboy, which is cliche, but I always enjoy that type of character, so I liked Arya. And there's Tyrion the dwarf. I forget how you say his name. He's a very witty and crude character. I really enjoyed reading about him. He was funny, and I liked that he was sort of a gray character. You didn't really know if he was completely good or bad. Yes, he seems to be very loyal to his family, but at the same time he seems to want to stay under the radar. He's more concerned with survival rather than power, which is always interesting to read about. And then there's Dany, or Daenerys. She was probably one of my favorite characters to read about, even though her scenes were more disturbing than others. Hers were more racy, and then there was her creepy brother. I just thought her story was one of the more fascinating to read about. She was essentially exiled from her home and thrown into this frightening situation where she has to live amongst the Dothraki, which are the horse people, and their traditions and morals are a lot different from her own, and I think for anyone they'd be very kind of a scary place to live. But she made the best of it and really turned it around to her advantage. And even though she did have the privilege of being the Khaleesi, which is like a princess, which you think would make it more bearable, but the Dothraki have a very crude lifestyle, and even the Khaleesi is sort of an oppressive position. She didn't allow herself to be treated as a slave. Instead of sulking in self-pity, she accepted the situation and the circumstances and then did something about it. She stands up for herself and says, this is how it's going to be, even if that goes against the Dothraki ways. And that's a form of bravery you don't see very much. And by the end of the book, she's done very well for herself, and you pretty much don't want to mess with her. My opinion of this book is that it didn't quite live up to the hype. I was expecting it to be a lot more epic. Well, I guess it kind of had that epic feel to it, but it just wasn't what I was expecting it to be about, I guess. But I ended up liking it anyway. I was completely absorbed by the first couple hundred pages, and then it kind of slowed down and got more of this soap opera kind of feel to it. And then it picked up again, and it kept my interest the whole time, and I always wanted to know what was going to happen next. The world building and the plot are kind of weak at times, and it's more of a character-driven book than plot-driven, which is fine, but if you don't end up liking the characters, then it's really hard to stay interested in the story. I liked the characters, even though the plot and events were kind of typical for this type of story. There was still enough mystery and intrigue to keep me reading. It's not the most amazing as a standalone novel, but it is a great introduction to the rest of the series, and I've heard that the plot gets a lot better in the other books. Overall, I enjoyed the writing style. It had that very medieval feel to it, but it was definitely flawed at times. Sometimes it's just hard to picture what he's describing, and I think watching the HBO series has helped with that a little bit. It's neat to see the characters come to life, even though I do enjoy picturing them myself. There were so many characters in this book that they kind of blurred together at times. The show helped them each stand out a little more for me, even though in the show the characters are older than they are in the book. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars, which means I really liked it. I didn't love it, but it was still a good read and enjoyable. But would I recommend this book? I think it depends. It's definitely not going to be everyone's cup of tea. If it interests you, I'd say read it if you're willing to commit to the entire series, which is kind of a big commitment considering how long each book is. But if you're in the mood for a very long story and to get attached to characters, then go for it. I will say that this is definitely an adult novel. It has a lot of graphic scenes, descriptions. There's rape, incest, murder, violence, sexism, and a lot of disturbing content. So just be aware of that and keep that in mind.